Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. As it was said before, my name is Aaron Purdy, and the Outreach and Education Lead for the Victoria Office of OceanWise's Whales Initiative, specifically the BC Cetacean Sightings Network. And I'm super excited to be here to chat with you all about whales. First off, I do want to acknowledge that being in Victoria, I am presenting from the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen, Stonkeys, and WSÁNEĆ nations. I'm incredibly grateful to be able to live and work on this land, be able to present to you all today about these animals that are so important to this environment, and hopefully share some useful knowledge for you all. So to start us off, I'll go show you a little bit of what this agenda looks like. I have packed far too much information in here to do in an hour. I'm going to try anyways. First off, I'll give a little bit of information about what the BC Cetacean Sightings Network is, and then we're going to dive straight into Whale ID 101. We'll talk about cetacean cues, how you can actually spot whales when you're out on the water. As marine educators, I'm sure plenty of you know about these things already, but we'll talk about them as well. We'll dive in, we'll talk about whale ID, how to actually identify the many different species that live in British Columbia, as well as down into Washington State and Oregon as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about what you can actually do to help all of these different species that we have on our coast. So, diving in, I'm focused in British Columbia, so I'm going to talk about that for the most part, just because that's where most of my information comes from. We are lucky enough here in British Columbia to have over 23 species of whales, dolphins, and porpoises, otherwise known as cetaceans, that live off our coast. It's incredibly rare to have so many different species, and it is an absolute treat to have them all. Unfortunately, 12 of the populations that live off of our coast are considered at risk according to Canada's Species at Risk Act. So whether being considered endangered, critically endangered, threatened, or at risk, it makes it a little bit hard. So what we want to know is where these animals are living, what their key hotspots are, and how we can best know where to find these animals so that we can protect them as best as we can. However, it becomes a little bit difficult. When you look at our coastline, just in British Columbia alone, we have over 25,000 kilometers of coastline. It makes it very hard to actually keep our eyes on this water, particularly for here in Victoria. I'm in an office with me and one other full-time employee, which means between the two of us, we're supposed to be covering the entire southern Vancouver Island region, as well as into the Gulf Islands, and as well as a little bit down into Washington State. We're not able to do that by ourselves. So that's where the BC Cetacean Sighting Network comes in. This is one of Canada's longest running and most successful citizen science programs. And what we do is we collect sightings of cetaceans and sea turtles from BC's waters. Where these coming from are all sorts of different people. We collect from sightings from over 7,000 observers at this point. These include coastal citizens, recreational fishers, recreational boaters, professional mariners, ecotourism operators. All sorts of people will report their sightings of whales into us. We then put those into a database. We have a database of over 300,000 sightings at this point, spanning over 20 years, which is amazing. And then what do we use those sightings for? Well, it's used for conservation-based research of all sorts. We do some of our own research ourselves, but we also supply those data to many different groups, including people in academia, in government, anyone who's doing conservation-based research. So what does 300,000 sightings look like? Well, it doesn't look like this because this is only a portion of them. This is around 200,000 sightings. As you can see, they are scattered all along the coast of British Columbia, as well as down into Washington State. And you can see that they are absolutely all over the place. It's without our dedicated observers, we would be absolutely nowhere. So with this incredible effort that they're all able to put in, we can collect these sightings, learn more about where the key habitats are for these different species. As I mentioned before, how are these data used? Well, it's used for learning about the abundance, occurrence, and distribution of different species, identifying areas of concern, of particular conservation concern. We share them for different conservation-based research projects, And then I'll talk a little bit later on about increasing situational awareness. So letting mariners know about nearby vessels, nearby cetaceans. We can let them know and they can actually decrease their impact on animals as well. I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation here. One of the main ways that we collect sightings are through the Whale Report app. I'll talk about this as well, but I do encourage anyone who is interested, who does spend time on or near the water, to download the Whale Report app. Is a great way to learn about the different whales on our coast, as well as being able to contribute to conservation. All right, so that's all of the beginning stuff out of the way. Let's actually talk about the animals at hand, cetaceans. Cetaceans, as I mentioned before, these are all animals that include whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Cetacean, just the Latin word for whale. And we are going to talk about cetacean cues. How do you actually find the whales when you're out on or near the water? So one of the things that most people come to when I ask for them what the best way to spot a whale are their blows. This is when the whale comes to the surface, they exhale all of that warm air that's in their lungs, shoots out into the colder atmosphere, and the vapor that's in their lung condenses, showing off these beautiful, fantastic blows. Not only can you spot individual whales using these blows, but you're actually able to identify different species with the shape and size of those blows as well. You can see on the far left, that very tall column-like blow is very indicative of a larger whale, like a humpback whale. In the middle, it's a little bit smaller and kind of almost heart-shaped is how it's been described. That's indicative of a gray whale. And then you see that small bushy blow, of course, of the killer whales on the right. Another way to spot whales is splashes. As these massive animals come launching themselves out of the water and crashing back down onto the surface as they breach. They can make huge splashes. Not only are you able to see these, but also hear them as well. So keeping your ears open when you're out on the water is very, very good. But not only for large splashes from these massive whales as well, but sometimes smaller splashes can be heard if they're in great numbers. The picture on the left you can see is a group of Pacific white-sided dolphins. They can be in populations up to 200, even 300 individuals all together at once. And when there's jumping out through the water, it can sound like rushing water, or like you're next to a river when there's that many animals splashing out of the water. So keeping both your eyes and your ears open can be really useful for finding these animals. Another thing to look for, as I'm sure you know, as marine educators, the entire environment is interconnected. So keeping your eyes open, not just for whales themselves, but looking at the cues from other species can be really helpful for getting an idea of what other species might be around. If you see a large aggregation of seabirds that are floating up near the water, diving down, looks like they might be feeding on some type of bait ball underneath. Maybe that's because there's a whale species that's feeding on that same bit of fish down beneath the surface. If you see pinnipeds or seals and sea lions that are kind of acting on edge, calling out, rafting up together, and then quickly maybe hauling out onto dry land, could be a sign that some transient killer whales are nearby as well. So keeping an eye open, not just for whales themselves, but other species is a great way to potentially spot whales when you're out near the water. Then finally, I'll talk a little bit about auditory and olfactory cues. I already mentioned the sound of whales breaching and crashing down onto the water, that running water sound for large groups of dolphins. But on calm days, you can often also hear the breath of these animals. They're absolutely massive. They come to the surface. That huge exhale on a calm day is definitely audible over long distances. And if the wind is lucky and if you're in the right spot, sometimes you can even smell these animals as they come to the surface. Often described as being kind of a fishy or sulfury smell as they come and exhale can be one way that you are able to find these animals. All right, so you've actually found a whale out on the water. You have identified it, you've seen the cues, and you've spotted it. How do you actually go about identifying that whale species? Well, the main thing you're going to look for are different key features to help you focus on, so that you're not just looking at the whole animal. You want to pinpoint the key things to identify that species. What are the things you should be looking for? Well, the first one is size. If you see an animal that is the size of two semi-trucks, you're probably going to be able to tell that it's not a porpoise. I have this picture here. I don't know why it has a picture of a brontosaurus. I don't know if anyone knows how long a brontosaurus is. That's not something you see in your daily life, but maybe the school buses are a little bit better of a reference. But getting an overall idea of how big the animal is going to be a great way to identify what type of species it might be. If you're able to see the back of the animal and see the dorsal fin, dorsal referring to the back and that fin that's there, looking at both the size and shape of that fin can be really useful in identifying the species. Could be low and lumpy like you see in a humpback whale, triangular like you see in the different porpoise species that we have off our coast, falcate or curved like you see in dolphins, specifically often in Pacific white-sided dolphins, or of course that very tall enigmatic fin that you see in our killer whale species. Don't only look for the dorsal fins. If you see the pectoral fins, pectoral referring to your pecs, these are the front arms, if you will, of the animal. Looking at the size and shape of those pectoral fins can be super useful. Not just looking for the shape, but even the coloration as well. You can see the animal in the bottom left here has that distinct white band that is indicative of the minke whale species and can be a really good clue for looking for that, identifying that species. Finally, the last fin, we're talking about the flukes. These are the tails of the animals. Looking at the size, shape, coloration can be super useful for not just identifying the species, but an individual animal as well. The humpback in the top right-hand corner, the different colorations and scars and markings that we can see on their tails can be very useful in identifying individual animals, let alone the species. It essentially acts like a fingerprint. By analyzing the different colorations that you see on these animals can actually allow you to identify a certain individual. Last one I'll talk about here is the skin. Both looking at the color and texture, it can give you some indications of what species it might be. If it's covered in ectoparasites, little barnacles and whale lice that might be living on the animal, like in the top left, that's a really good clue that that's a gray whale. You may see scars and scratches, like you can see in the top right-hand corner. Those are Rizzo's dolphins that are well known for having scars and scratches all over their body. In the bottom right, we have a fin whale with the white coloration on only the right side of its jaw. On the left, it only has a dark coloration. So looking out for these types of things can be really useful as well. All right. So you found the animal, you know what key features to look for. The next thing is to actually identify the different species. I'm going to be talking about some of the most commonly seen species that we have off of the coast here, but keeping those key features in mind for other species is going to be able to help you identify some of the more rare ones if you come across them. We are going to start small and work our way up. And when I say small, it's all relative because these are still very big animals. We'll start off with the Odontosites. Odontosite is another way of saying toothed whale. Odonto meaning toothed, sete meaning whale in Latin. So these are the toothed whales. These animals are going to be our dolphins and our porpoises. The main things that they all have in common, as you could probably have guessed, is that they all have teeth, but it's not just that. You'll also note that they don't have ventral pleats. When I say pleats, I mean folds, ventral meaning the belly. So these are folds along the underside of the neck of the animal. If you're able to see that and see that they don't have any folds whatsoever, then you know that that is going to be a toothed whale. The other whales, baleen whales, do have folds on the underside of their neck. This is for allowing them to expand their buccal cavity, allowing them to take huge gulps of water and allowing their mouth to extend to accept all of that water. You also note that all of the Odontosites, the toothed whales, all only have one blowhole. That's because the second blowhole has been co-opted into for another purpose, into a separate chamber that is specifically used for creating echolocation clicks. So these are the sounds that they send out into the water using this modified nasal cavity, sending those clicks out into the water to actually be able to sense their environment. So We'll start off with the Odontosites, and I said we're going to start small. We're going to start with the smallest here, the harbor porpoise. These animals are only about 1.75 meters long, so about as long as I am tall, not particularly large when it comes to whales, but still a pretty sizable animal. You'll generally see these animals in groups of around 1 to 5. They're often considered shy if you're going to anthropomorphize them. They generally don't like swimming around boats. They're not going to be bow riding like you'll see in other porpoise or dolphin species. And that's a really good way to identify them as well. Looking at the behavior of an animal can be really useful in identifying different species. You'll see that they have a triangular shaped fin. I mentioned that before. Often you don't see the full body of the animal, so you don't see that two-tone coloration. You usually just see the dark gray, or sometimes described as brown backside of the animal. But if you do see the if they are porpoising up out of the water, you'll often see that kind of two-tone coloration. One of the main ways to identify this species off of, in comparison to others, is the shape of their fin. It is very pointy and triangular. And when you see them in their regular behavior, it's often just this calm, quiet coming up through the water. On calm days, you can often hear the small sound of them coming to the surface, as opposed to the breath of a humpback whale. It's just a little, just a soft little thing as it comes to the surface. The next species that we have up is the Doll's porpoise, around 2 meters long, so a little bit bigger than our harbor porpoise. And as you can imagine, they often are mixed up with the harbor porpoise. They are similarly sized, similar shape, but the main thing that you're going to be looking for with these animals are two things. One is their behavior, and the second is their caudal peduncle. If you look along the back end of the animal, you can see that it has this large hump right before its tail fluke. That's called the caudal peduncle, and on the Doll's porpoise, it is quite large. This is a huge mound of muscle that allows this animal to swim very fast through the water. In comparison, you are much more likely to see these animals bow riding. When they come to the surface, as they're moving incredibly quickly, they often have this rooster tail type splash as they come porpoising through the water. And also, of course, looking for that two-toned coloration, not just on their body, but also on their dorsal fin as well. You'll note that on the trailing edge of the dorsal fin of these animals, they often have that white kind of frosting tips, sometimes taking up even half of the entire dorsal fin there. However, they aren't always swimming fast through the water. Sometimes you will see them swimming a little bit more slowly. If that's the case, the thing you're going to look for is whether or not the animal looks like a wheel rolling through the water or a box rolling through the water. If it's a wheel, then you're looking at a harbor porpoise. But if you're seeing a box, you know you're seeing that caudal peduncle. First comes the dorsal fin, then the peduncle. Dorsal fin, peduncle. A great way for identifying this animal if they aren't moving fast, like you can see in this clip here. All right. Plowing ahead, we're going to move up larger in size to the Pacific white-sided dolphin. These animals getting up to about 2.5 meters long. You can find them in much larger groups than you would either the Doll's porpoise or the harbor porpoises. These can be in animals up to anywhere from 10 up to 200, even 300 individuals. You're also going to find these animals often a little bit more offshore than you would the other porpoise species. However, they still will be found right close into shore in large numbers still. As for behavior, these animals are much more acrobatic, very social. They often are seen bow riding or riding in the wakes of boats. And it's really hard to mistake this animal for any other species for that behavior alone. But looking at the physical features, you can see that very curved dorsal fin that is two-toned, the dark closer to the front of the animal and the lighter side coming off afterwards. If you do get a look at the front, the face of the animal, you'll notice that they do have a small beak, and it always has that black coloration as well. And then you also have those white flanks. So those are our three smaller cetaceans that we have off of our coast that are most commonly seen. The triangular single-toned fin of the harbor porpoise, that two-toned slightly larger fin of the Doll's porpoise with that caudal peduncle, and then the curved fin of the Doll's porpoise. All right, moving along, we're going to move to the larger dolphin that we have here. Of course, everyone knows the killer whales, and I have faith that all of you would be able to identify a killer whale if you were out on the water. Obviously, one of the most enigmatic species that we have off of our coast. Can be found anywhere from 5 or even a single individual all the way up to 30 or more traveling together. Males are generally going to be a little bit larger and of course have that taller dorsal fin. And also want to point out that saddle patch that's just behind their dorsal fin. That kind of white or gray coloration is going to be really useful, not only for identifying the individual, identifying the species, but also useful for seeing what type of ecotype that animal is. As I mentioned before, looking for that bushy shaped blow as they come to the surface can be useful for identifying species from afar. And of course, that cute white eye patch that makes them all look like pandas, a great thing to look for as well. So as I'm sure many of you know, looking at the dorsal fin of the animal is going to be helpful in helping you to identify whether it's a male or female that you're looking at. If it is nice and tall and straight, that's indicative of a male killer whale. This can get up to 6 feet tall. That's taller than I am, so an absolutely massive fin. The females is going to be a little bit shorter and often curved as well. When the animal is less than 10 years old, it's going to be a little bit harder to tell because both males and females do have a curved dorsal fin when they are quite young. However, if you do see a very small killer whale that has some of a yellow or red or pink pigmentation, both in the black and of course in the white of their body, that's a good sign that that's a very young individual, probably 2 years or less. So all useful things for identifying the different age groups of killer whales off of our coast. I mentioned before ecotypes. What is an ecotype? Well, these are genetically and culturally distinct groups of killer whales that live across the world. They almost are never going to be seen together and almost never are going to be interbreeding as well, largely due to that culture that they share. They aren't going to be mixing with other groups. On our coast, we have 3 different ecotypes. We have, of course, the resident killer whales. Those are the ones that get quite a bit of media attention, both separated into the northern and southern residents. We have the bigs, otherwise known as transient killer whales. These are killer whales that focus exclusively on eating marine mammals. And then we have the offshore killer whales, as you could probably imagine, generally found more offshore. There are ways to identify the different ecotypes based off of both the saddle patch, but as well the dorsal fin of these animals. When looking at resident killer whales, one thing to look for in the dorsal fin is whether or not it has a point that is pointed more towards the back of the animal. If you look at the transient or the bigs killer whale, that point is going to be pointed towards the top of going up above the animal. And then, of course, our offshore killer whale is going to have more of a rounded dorsal fin. That can be kind of hard to see if you don't have good binoculars and you aren't looking, don't have a particularly good angle. So another good thing to look for is that saddle patch, that gray coloration on the back. You're going to look for what is called an open or a closed saddle patch. As you can see on the picture on the left, we have a resident killer whale who has an open saddle patch. That means that that black crescent is kind of dipping down into the white of that coloration. In both transient and offshore killer whales, you're not going to see that at all. It's going to just be one single white color. One thing to look for as well in the transient killer whales, their saddle patch, often the coloration will go past the midline of the dorsal fin, whereas in residents, it's generally going to be never go quite that far forward towards the animal. So another really good thing to look for. So was everyone listening? Because I do have a test. Taking a look at this image here, I want you to see whether or not you can think it is a resident, a transient, or an offshore killer whale. Think in your head, looking at both the dorsal fin, the shape of that, as well as that, that saddle patch there. So most people don't have their cameras on, but raise your hand if you think that it is a resident killer whale. Raise your hand if you think it's a transient killer whale. Raise your hand if you think it's an offshore killer whale. I'm happy to see, I don't think anyone raised their hand for an offshore. That's very good because you can see the land right there. So that's a pretty dead giveaway. This is a group of resident killer whales. I know I was saying before that the saddle patch often has that open coloration and rarely goes past the midline. It's not always the case. So if you do take a look at the point of these animals' dorsal fins, that point is pointing a little bit more towards the back of the animal. All right, we have round number 2. Taking a look at the saddle patch and the dorsal fin. Raise your hand if you think it's a resident killer whale. How about a transient killer whale? How about an offshore killer whale? Once again, nobody fell for the fact that the land is right there. These are, in fact, transient killer whales. You can see the tip of those dorsal fins is pointed more towards the sky, less so towards the back of the animal. And you can see that all 3 of these individuals do have a closed saddle patch. So you can see it can be difficult, but with some practice and a little bit of luck, you might be able to identify the different ecotypes that we have. Now, it's not just physical characteristics that you're going to be looking for identifying different species, also going to be looking at their behavior as well. When it comes to the resident killer whales, these animals only eat fish and almost exclusively on salmonid species. If we take a look at their diet, this is from a study in 2016, they found that the diet of resident killer whales consisted almost exclusively of Chinook salmon, nearly 80% of their diet being on Chinook, and the rest coming from other salmon species, coho, steelhead, chum, and pink, making up a good portion as well. There's very small numbers of other types of fish and squid found in their stomach contents as well, but they did find that Chinook was the most important for them. This makes sense. Chinook is a very fatty fish. It's really, really calorie dense. If you are trying to get as much energy as possible into your system, you're going to want to go for the Big Mac as opposed to the kale. And that's exactly what this is. The Chinook is the equivalent of a Big Mac as opposed to exclusively hunting kale. You'd have to eat a lot of kale to get as much energy as you would out of a single Big Mac. And these animals are smart. They want to go for those fatty foods. In addition to what foods they're eating, these animals do have different social structures as well. They have very stable matriline groups, and they tend to travel in fairly large groups as well. So what do I mean by matrilines? Well, this is going to be a single mother that is traveling with all of her offspring and perhaps a sister or 2. The matriline is the most important unit. Everyone is going to follow the oldest female in the group. She is the most important, and she's going to be deciding where they travel and what they do. Matrilines are going to be the most important unit, but they are going to be often found multiple matrilines swimming together. If you have 2 matrilines that are spending more than 50% of their time together, that's what we would consider a pod. Different pods that share a similar vocal dialect. So these are distinct vocalizations that these animals learn to produce from listening to the sounds of their mother and their kin. These are going to be considered a clan. And then once all these clans are found generally in the same area, that is how we determine a population. As you've probably heard, the resident killer whales are quite a at-risk species. They're both considered endangered and threatened. That's based off of the different population that we're talking about. The southern resident killer whales are considered endangered with only 73 individuals left in the wild. Thankfully, the northern population is doing a little bit better, around 300 individuals, and they are considered threatened. When we take a look at their once again, this is British Columbia focused, are my maps here. We can see the critical habitat, why they're called northern and southern resident killer whales is based off of their critical habitat. The southern residents are going to be found quite a bit in the Juan de Fuca Strait and the Salish Sea between British Columbia and Washington State, whereas the northern residents are, their critical habitat is in Juan de Fuca, and the Strait of Georgia Johnston Strait, there we go, north of Vancouver Island. But these animals, their habitat does overlap. Both resident populations can be found down into Washington State, further south of that into Oregon and even California as well at different times of the year. As I mentioned before, these animals are highly vocal and they share these matrilineal dialects. This is all for the purpose of avoiding inbreeding. They're not going to be mating with individuals that sound too different from, sound too similar to them. They're only going to try to mate with individuals that sound a little bit different. All right, we'll move to a different ecotype here. We have the bigs or the transient killer whales. They do have a little bit of a larger population. It says 500 here. I've seen estimates that these animals are on the rise up to 600, maybe even 700 individuals. And these are the marine mammal hunters. When we take a look at their diet, it is consisting largely of pinnipeds, harbor seals, and sea lions are going to be some of their main source of diet, but they will go for porpoises and even larger whales at some points as well. Generally, their behavior is different in that they travel in smaller groups, sometimes even just a single individual by themselves. And they're generally mostly silent. I bet if you think about it for a moment, you could understand why they would want to be silent as opposed to the fish-eating species, because they are hunting, and they're hunting animals that also use their hearing underwater. You can imagine a seal is going to be listening for sounds of any incoming prey that is close by, and so these animals want to be nice and quiet so that they can sneak up on their prey as best as possible. Finally, we'll talk briefly about the offshore killer whales. Less is known about this population, as you can imagine, because they are found more offshore. It's a little bit harder to get out there, more expensive to research these animals as well. But they tend to have kind of a mix of traits from the resident populations and the transient killer whales. They tend to travel in large groups, but it's a little bit more fluid. They don't seem to have as tight a bond with their matrilines as you would see in the resident populations. They are highly vocal as well, and they do tend to feed on fish, especially on shark species. When you think about that, sharks often have very rough skin. And one thing that we found in offshore populations is very old individuals with teeth that are almost completely worn down. You can imagine this is all of these teeth in a healthy individual would be nice and pointed for grabbing onto their food. But with these worn down teeth, this individual probably didn't have, those teeth weren't even poking out through the gums. So how would this animal actually be catching food? Well, it's actually probably that other members of its pod would actually be feeding it as well. It'd be catching food and sharing that. A common trait that we do see in lots of different killer whale populations around the world. But what do these animals feed on? As I mentioned, sharks and rays are some of their main foods that they go for. It seems that Pacific sleeper shark, blue shark, and Pacific spiny dogfish are some of the main shark species they go for, as well as some different types of fish as well. Okay, deep breath in, deep breath out. We got through all of the common odontosites that we have off of the coast here on the West Coast. We're going to change gears and talk about the mysticetes. These are the baleen whales. There are many different traits, but that these animals share. The main ones that we're going to talk about here, they don't have teeth. Instead of teeth, they have baleen. Baleen is a substance made out of the same substance as your fingernails and your hair. If you feel your fingernails, that's very similar to what these baleen plates are like. They have these growing up to 200, over 400 plates of these in their mouth at a time that they're going to be using for filter feeding. In addition, they are going to have varying numbers of ventral pleats. Those are the folds on the underside of the animal's neck, allowing them to take huge gulps of water to then filter out to find their food. And finally, they have two separate blowholes. Their nostrils migrated to the top of their head, two separate ones. They aren't going to be echolocating because of that. All right, let's talk about the smallest that we have here off of our coast is the minke whale. This, for a baleen whale, is actually very small. It's only 9 meters long. That's about as long as a large adult male killer whale. For behaviors, they're generally solitary animals traveling by themselves, maybe a mother and a calf. They're often found in coastal waters and, yeah, are considered a little bit more shy. We take a look at their physical characteristics, looking for that distinctly curved dorsal fin about 2/3 of the way along their back. They have that dark, kind of dark gray coloration and a very streamlined body looking like a torpedo as they move through the water. You'll see they have many ventral pleats along the underside of their mouth. And one thing that you'll often note is they're very frequently seen associated with seabirds. Whether or not they are following around seabirds that are hunting on fish or the birds are following them, we're not entirely sure. It definitely could go one way or the other, but they're often seen feeding together on the different bait balls that they'll create on herring, capelin, things along those lines. When you take a look at a minke whale, one distinct thing to look for is the white coloration on their pectoral fins. As it comes, if you're lucky enough to see one close up, you can see that white coloration on their pectoral fin, very indicative of a minke whale. All right, we'll move on to a much larger species. These are gray whales getting up to 14 meters long. Generally also not seen in large groups, 1 or 2 individuals, but these animals are frequently seen very close to shore. Even if you don't have a boat, this is an animal that you are going to be able to see, get a very good look at because of their behaviors of coming so close to shore. Why they're coming so close? They like to feed in very shallow areas, often close to shore where they can eat on some of the benthic invertebrates, the invertebrates that are living in the mud and silt close to shore. That's some of their favorite food to feed on. Other things to identify from this species: one, despite this picture showing they don't really have a dorsal fin. Instead, the things that you're going to look for are those knuckle-like bumps along the peduncle of the animal. Very indicative of a gray whale. Also, that mottled coloration. Not only is it going to be mottled on the skin itself, but taking a look at different clusters of barnacles and whale lice, these animals are often covered in lots of different ectoparasites. Yeah, you can see here all of those different traits, those knuckles instead of that dorsal fin being a very key feature to look for. In addition, these animals often, as I mentioned before, have a kind of heart-shaped blow. And there, as this animal dives, you can see those knuckle-like ridges along the back there. One thing you'll often see as these animals come close to shore is they'll actually stick up their pectoral fins in the air like so, as they roll on their sides, feeding on the benthic invertebrates beneath. If you're in a particularly shallow area and the tide goes out, you can actually sometimes see feeding pits. It'll just look like big holes, divots that have been dug out by these animals. And if the tide goes out, you can actually see where these animals were feeding. So a good thing to keep an eye open if you do have time and you see these animals feeding in a shallow area and the weather or the tide is going to be going out pretty soon, a great thing to look for. All right, moving on, even larger, 15 to 18 meters long as a school bus and a half. We're talking about the humpback whales. Very easy, one of the most commonly seen species off of our coast, very easy to identify because of so many different features. That kind of nubby little dorsal fin where they get their name from, those long, majestic pectoral fins, that beautiful tail that comes up out of the water. Most whale species, you aren't going to see them bring their fluke up out of the water when they dive, but these deep diving animals like the humpbacks, you are often going to see that beautiful fluke as they come up out of the water. And then of course, this is a very acrobatic species, often seen breaching, lunging through the water, a beautiful sight to see. One thing to look for as well, if you only see the front of the animal, are these things called tubercults. These are actually modified hair cells that are found just behind the upper lip of the animal. they're thought to potentially be able to sense movement in the water, similar to a whisker. Some people think that they might actually be able to have some chemosensory ability as well, so they're actually almost smelling the water with these tubercles as well. A great thing to look for identifying this species. And then, of course, that tall, beautiful blow is another good thing to look for. Where are these animals found on our coast? Well, like many different baleen animals, baleen species, these are a migratory animal. They're going to be spending their summers up here along our coast, up all the way up into Alaska, before heading down south for the winters, for the breeding season. They're going to be heading down to Mexico and Hawaii for their breeding. But more and more, we're actually starting to see more individuals who are overwintering here along our coast, which is a little bit strange. Whether or not that is a normal thing, and we're only just starting to see it now as their population is starting to increase, we're not entirely sure. But it also potentially could be with global water temperatures rising, they're feeling less need to actually travel down south. They might not be catching the cues that usually would be triggering them in their migration. Something that people are researching right now because we're not entirely sure. Of course, as I mentioned before, those beautiful long pectoral fins, a great thing to look for identifying this species. One thing I love about the species, their genus Megaptera, mega meaning big, ptera meaning wing. These big wings of these animals, they definitely look like wings as they come flying up out through the water. But you can see those scalloped edge, that kind of bumpy edge along the leading bit of the pectoral fins. Those are actually useful. They are going to be catching water and turning it into a little bubble of water that actually is going to increase the laminar flow over top of these fins, actually allowing them to cut through the water far more efficiently. From studying these animals, there was an engineer who realized that there was a way to mimic this on wind turbines. So if you ever see a wind turbine with their big long blades, look for that scalloped edge as well. They've actually found that by adding that onto these wind turbines, they can actually increase the efficiency of these wind turbines by up to 10, even 15%, which is absolutely incredible. Another great reason why we should be studying and protecting these animals, because we have so much to learn from them. As I mentioned before, humpback whales are very well known for having those big, beautiful tail flukes that you can actually identify individual animals from as well. A website I'll encourage as marine educators you might be interested, if you haven't heard of, is happywhale.org. This is a great place where you can submit your photographs that you have of humpback whales, flukes. And they're going to be people who are going to identify these whale flukes, and you can actually then find individuals and track their movements across the world. A really cool way to get a closer connection to the individual animal that you're seeing when you're out on the water, and to be able to show where that individual animal is traveling and what its day-to-day life might look like. Humpback whales are also incredibly well known for many different feeding strategies. One is bubble net feeding that you can see a group of individuals doing here. This is where a group of different whales are going to, one is going to create a net of spiraling bubbles around a group of fish or krill, and the animals are going to come up underneath and use that net as it corrals their food source into one area to more easily capture their prey. To give you an idea as to what it would look like underwater as this animal is doing that, creating that bubble net. In addition, you'll often see these animals doing something called lunge feeding, where if there's a more tight-packed group of fish in a bait ball, such as this, you can see here, likely herring, the animal's going to charge forward, opening its massive mouth and taking a huge gulp of water. Just an awesome sight to see, to be able to see those animals doing that feeding behavior. However, come to my favorite. This one is called trap feeding and was actually first seen in 2011 off the coast of Vancouver Island. This is where a single individual will sit with his mouth open and just go like this and just move the fish into their mouth. A really cool sight to see. Why they're actually doing this, not entirely sure. Maybe it's really useful for feeding on fish species that are kind of a little bit more diffuse, not as densely packed, but a really cool sight to see. It was seen from just 2 individuals in 2011, and by 2015, later on, 16 different individuals were seen using this feeding technique. So this is probably an indication that these animals are learning new techniques for feeding. They may be even teaching their offspring how to be doing these different things. If you do ever see anything like this, definitely a cool thing to report, as researchers are very interested in all of this. All right. We've gone through the whirlwind of different species off of our coast. I'll talk, if you are interested in learning more, I do want to point to 3 different resources. One is the Whale Report app. That is the BC Cetaceans app used for reporting sightings, the one in the middle here. On the left, Marine Mammals of British Columbia by John Ford, an excellent book. And then one that's particularly good for marine educators like yourself, bewhalewise.org. Highly recommend going to check them out because they have an educator's toolkit that you can find. It has everything from information on specific species to lesson plans from everything from K to 12. Highly recommend going to their website as well for finding information on proper boating guidelines around marine mammals. All right. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to move quickly through this last section here of how you can protect whale species and get involved in ocean conservation. Unfortunately, on our coast, many different whale species are still recovering from the long era of whaling. From 1907 to 1967, just 5 stations caught nearly 25,000 whales in just 50 years. These is the whales that they were focusing on were some of the largest whale species. So things like humpbacks, blue whales, sei whales. And these animals are incredibly long-lived, easily living up to 60, 80, even up to 100 years. So as you can imagine, these long-lived species are very slow to reproduce, and thereby they're slow to recover. So it was only just in the 1970s when whaling was finally banned off of our coast. And so as you can imagine, these populations are still feeling the after effects of this. Unfortunately, that isn't the only problem that they have to face. There are many different threats that these animals have, including toxins, reduction in food supply, disturbance from nearby vessels, both the noise and the physical disturbance, as well as entanglement in marine debris. The main one I want to focus on just for today is talking about vessel disturbance, because it is one that people can get involved in both negatively and positively in their everyday lives very easily. As you can see in this picture, there's the 2 killer whales that are spotted right here, and we can see many different vessels. Every single one has the potential to influence these animals. The large ferry is going to be making huge amounts of noise underwater. This recreational boat is boating quite close to the animals as well, also going to be making a lot of noise. And then even these kayaks, if they get too close, are going to be potentially disrupting the natural behaviors of these individuals and maybe hindering their ability to find food. If we focus on the Salish Sea here, you can see in the blue and green areas that are highlighted there, that is the critical habitat for the southern resident killer whales. And those blue lines are some of the major shipping lanes that come through that area. And you can see there is almost a direct overlap. It's not only the southern resident killer whales that are going to be in this area, but it is many different whale species as well. Humpbacks, minke whales, porpoises of all sorts are going to be using these areas, and vessel disturbance is a huge problem for them. The main one that you'll often hear is noise. The Odontosites, the toothed whales, are going to be using echolocation to find their food. If they aren't able to hear those clicks as they come back, reverberate off their prey up through their jaw and into their ear, they're not going to be able to find their food. Not only that, they're very social creatures communicating with each other, particularly things like killer whales. Those socialization calls are going to be masked potentially by nearby boat traffic. And it's not just toothed whales as well. Baleen whales are communicating with each other over long distances, and underwater noise has the potential to mask that as well. I'll show you an audio clip right here. At the beginning, you can hear the rapid clicks of a killer whale that is using echolocation underwater. And then shortly afterwards, some socialization calls, and then a large cruise ship comes by. And you can see just how much it masks. There are the clicks, and the socialization calls. And coming around a corner, so you can hear there, nearly 90% of the socialization calls were masked due to the nearby vessel noise, and 100% of the clicks were masked from that large vessel as well. As you can imagine, a huge problem for these animals. Not only is the sound going to be detrimental, but just the mere presence of vessels can disrupt natural behaviors. Anything from a kayak or a stand-up paddleboard all the way up to a cruise ship has the ability to kind of push these animals out of their natural feeding areas. As you can imagine, if you're kayaking along and get in the way of a killer whale who is slowly stalking up behind a seal, if you get in their way and they get distracted by that kayak that you're in, that might be a huge amount of energy that was wasted as they lost their ability to catch that seal. So just the physical presence of boats can have a detriment on these animals. And then lastly, of course, is vessel collisions, a huge cause for mortality in some of the larger species, things like fin whales and humpback whales, who are often feeding in similar locations to where shipping traffic is going to be moving. And while it isn't as seen as quite as often with things like killer whales, with the southern resident killer whales, if they only have 73 individuals, if they lose one due to a vessel strike, and if a ship does strike a killer whale, it is very likely going to result in death. It's going to be a huge blow to that population. So one thing that we at the BC Cetacean Sighting Network are doing to try to reduce the impact of vessels on different cetacean species is through something called the Whale Report Alert System. This is a coast-wide conservation tool that is focused on reducing the impact of vessels by giving them a fair warning of when there are whale species close by. This is targeted towards commercial mariners, so this is vessels that are trying to not find any whales. So things like BC ferries, Washington State ferries, the pilots who are bringing in the large container ships, they have access to the RAS to get these notifications when a whale is nearby. How it actually works is we use the sightings that are coming in through the BC Cetacean Sighting Network. They're submitted from us from all sorts of different people, goes through an automatic data verification system, and then it is automatically forwarded to mariners who are within 10 nautical miles of that sighting. It's going to come either as a text message or to their operations center, which would then be relayed to them. Once they have that information, they can use that to try to mitigate their impact, either by slowing down, altering course, just keeping it in mind. If it's behind them, they can dismiss it, and then they're given the opportunity to provide feedback of how they're actually mitigating their impact on these animals. So what it comes down to is one thing I do want to take you all to take away from this is by reporting your sightings, whether that's into us at the BC Cetacean Sighting Network, to other sightings networks as well, you are going to be helping to protect whales. Whether it's through learning about where these animals are, where their key habitats are, or through something like the Whale Report Alert System, you are going to be helping individuals reduce their impact on these different populations. With that, I want to say a big thank you to you folks for having me here today. Thank you to the Government of Canada for providing funding through various different sources for the BC Cetacean Sighting Network and for some of the outreach that we do here. I do want to leave up on here, this is the number if you are in Washington, if you are in British Columbia, the BC Marine Mammal Response Network, for calling in if you have do see an animal that's in distress. But if you do see an animal and you do want to report it to us, you can do so via the Whale Report app that is available for download on all smart devices, and we'd love to have your support. And with that, I would love to take any questions as I am 1 minute over.
Awesome. Amazing job keeping all of that information within the time frame. I'm quite impressed that you were able to sneak all that in there. And I think that we do have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone does have any questions for Aaron, let him know either in the chat or just unmute yourself. Or any comments or anything to share as well.
Well, I could ask something.
Orle, you could always ask something, couldn't you?
I know. I just wondered, those whale sites were in the early 1900s. What were they using the whale oil or the whale carcasses for, as I assume British Columbians weren't big on eating whales? And
yeah, it wasn't often used for eating whales, but it was used for many different purposes. Early 1900s, you would have been using it for lamp oil is one thing. It also would have been going into many different products in the creation of margarine, in the creation of soaps and things like that, a myriad of different purposes. It is a very useful product for creating different things, as it is a huge source of fat for a relatively low cost to actually bring that animal in.
So were those products sold in British Columbia, or were they sold in America?
I think it would. What I showed was just British Columbia. There was whaling down into the United States. They ended whaling quite a bit sooner than in Canada here. But those products would have been sold worldwide. Yeah.
And we've got 2 questions in the chat. Sorry, Orle, I didn't know if you were done.
I'm done.
2 questions in the chat. Linda wants to know if you're available for outreach in schools, like a virtual presentation.
Yes, sorry, Linda, I actually was forwarded your email and didn't get the chance to respond yet. I will send you an email sometime tomorrow here. We are available for school presentations, not just us, me as working with the BC CSN, but some of the other folks at OceanWise are able to give different types of presentations as well, so I can reach out to you.
Awesome, perfect. And Carrie is wondering about fin whales, and she says she's trying to figure out the different key features between fin and minke whales that she may have seen in Prince William Sound, Alaska.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm very excited for you for potential fin whale sighting. The main thing is size. Fin whales are absolutely massive. The second largest whale species in the world. So they're going to be around 25 meters long as opposed to the 9 meters long that a minke whale is going to be. If you're seeing it from a distance, can be a little bit hard sometimes. So one thing I would say to look for is when the animal comes up to the surface, you see the massive blow. The blowholes go down, and then you see the dorsal fin come up. With minke whales, you'll often see both the dorsal fin and the blowholes above the water at the same time. But the size is going to be the #1 thing. That's a really good question.
Cool. And then Kathy says, wants to know how social learning has affected distributions.
Social learning is going to be affecting distributions of different populations. That's a fantastic question that I'm not trained enough to know the answer to that. I could imagine it having a huge impact, particularly with the southern resident populations right now. Very recently, they lost the matriarch of their pod, and with that, a huge amount of knowledge was lost. And we also have seen that the southern residents haven't been following their traditional movements in the past couple years. Whether or not that is due to this loss of knowledge and someone else taking over in deciding where these animals are going, it's entirely possible and could be affecting their distribution. That's a really good question.
Cool. And then we had an ask and answer about remembering the key difference between the transient and offshore saddle patches. And so Tracy had offered that transients offshores tend not to have open saddle patches, whereas residents can, and where there's lots of black inside the saddle patches. So I didn't know if you wanted to just to remind about those differences.
Yeah, that's the main thing to look for, excuse me, is whether or not both the transient and the resident killer whales generally are going to have a closed saddle patch. The open saddle patches are mostly seen in the resident populations. In offshores, you'll see that saddle patch also doesn't generally cross the midline of the dorsal fin, whereas in transient killer whales, it often does pass that midline.
And I'm adding on to that question. The offshore whales, they don't generally come close to shore at all, or how far offshore is offshore?
You do have to go quite a bit offshore. We're talking closer to the shelf or even off the shelf. So quite a bit ways offshore.
Cool. So not something you would generally see in a recreational boat, say.
Yeah, unless you are a professional fisher or working with government and doing transects out there, or fixing navigational markers, then you're probably not going to be seeing them very frequently.
Good to know. And then Heather says, thanks for the comparison photos. They make it clear to see the differences, and they're sailboaters and have used the Whale Report app. And I know I'm super excited. We just got a boat. So this summer is going to be our first summer on our boat. And so I've already downloaded the app, and I'm trying to learn all the different ways to identify them myself. So that's really exciting for me too.
I will say that currently the Whale Report app is functioning both in British Columbia and Washington State, as well as up into southeastern Alaska. So we welcome any reports that you're able to bring.
Very cool. Any other questions for Aaron?
Ooh, I have
go
two.
ahead, Orle. Yeah.
Number one, we saw offshores when I worked on Soviet ships for the US government, and nobody believed us. So we reported it, and they told us, no, you didn't. You screwed up. The other question is, the offshores seem to have a very similar pattern to the Antarctica ones that, NOAA guys down there have seen. And I'm just wondering, in terms of who's related to whom in terms of genetics, do you think that the Antarctic whales, killer whales, are they at all related to the ones up here as compared to ones in South America or Asia?
That I'm not too sure of. If there have been any genetic studies that have looked at the similarities between these different groups, I'm not positive of that. But yeah, you are right in that they have some more similar types of behaviors. And so if the cultures are what is driving these separations in population, then it's certainly possible. And if it may seem like a very long distance for these animals to Northern Pacific population that is going to be closely related to an Antarctic population, these animals have, like the resident and the transient killer whales, have been separated for tens of thousands of years. So it's certainly possible that they could be more closely related and slowly moved over that time.
Thanks.
Whales in Antarctica will go after all sorts of different prey, and including penguins. There are some that just almost always eat penguins. So there's a whole brand new species they found there.
Yeah, there's multiple different ecotypes in Antarctica as well. So yeah, it's many different types. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention a comment I put in there. When I lived in British Columbia, I thought that the gray whales almost always ate stuff off the bottom, and I've seen them scooping up stuff out of the sand. Now I live in Oregon, and they have a completely different feeding pattern here. So I think they're real opportunists. They'll eat a lot of different things in a lot of different places. So here
it is, very true.
A shrimp that grows in huge numbers in the kelp beds. So they're right offshore. We see them all the time, right offshore in the kelp beds, in and around. And of course, they're not diving. They're just munching away at everything that's floating on the surface. So it's really
the population that we see along our coast here, the Pacific Coastal Feeding Group, they are really going for whatever they can and kind of munching along the way as they go travel along the coast for their migration. So yeah, I simplified it a little, but you're absolutely right. They're going overall for all sorts of things.
Yeah, they'll eat fish too. I mean, they're real opportunists.
100%, yeah.
Well, thanks again, Aaron. Thank you for the great presentation, and we hope to see you around one of our conferences again soon.
Awesome.
And
well,
thank you
so much
everyone for
having
joining
me.
us tonight. Okay.
So long, everyone.